When I first learned how to crochet in middle school, there was a lot that I simply did not know about crocheting. To help make the learning curve a little bit easier for anyone out there who is a beginner, today I'm going to share 6 things that I wish I knew when I was starting to crochet. Welcome to Crafters Autonomous. My name is Amanda and I am so glad you are here. Now, crochet is an awesome hobby to learn because it has a relatively low barrier to entry, meaning it's something that just about anybody can learn. You can get a hook and yarn for under $10 and that's really all you need to start, and you just have to set aside time to practice. However, learning to crochet can be so overwhelming because there's all these crazy words and you have to buy yarn and there's these fancy tools and gadgets. It's like, what do you actually need to know if you're learning? So this video is not going to cover things like stitches or how to actually crochet. These are going to be things that pop up when you're learning to crochet that you might not even realize. And had I realized these sooner, it would have made my learning experience much easier. So let's jump into the first thing I wish I knew when I started to crochet. And that is that there is a difference between US terminology and UK terminology. Now, when I say US and UK terminology, it's not referring to strictly those two places, but those are just kind of the categories. So someone in Canada crocheting, I actually don't know what Canadians use, if they use US or UK. If you're in Canada and you crochet, let me know which one is more popular up there. But places like Canada or South Africa or Brazil, wherever people are crocheting, even though they might not be in the US or the UK, they're going to use one of these categories of terminology. The main area where this gets confusing and can lead to some problems is UK terminology and US terminology. We use the same words and phrases, but they mean different things. For instance, the stitch that here in the US we call a single crochet stitch, that's called a double crochet stitch in the UK, and other areas that use UK terminology. To make things even more confusing, there is a stitch called the double crochet as well in US terminology. That corresponds to a treble stitch in UK terminology. And there's a US version of a treble stitch. So basically it's like there's all these different stitches and the US and UK versions are just slightly shifted off. So if you're watching a tutorial, reading a pattern, anything like that, it's important to double check whether or not it's in US terms or in UK terms. Fortunately, as people have gained more awareness about this, a lot of blogs and tutorials will let people know whether they're using US terminology or UK terminology. However, if they don't specifically say, here are a couple tips to figure it out. First, if you're on a blog or a YouTube channel, try to do a little digging and see if you can figure out where they're based. For instance, I'm based in the US, so on my channel I use US crochet terminology. Another trick that can be helpful is, generally speaking, there's not a single crochet stitch in UK terminology. So what that means is if you see a pattern or a tutorial where they talk about a single crochet stitch, most likely they're using US terminology. And if you find that you really just can't figure it out, you can always ask the creator or share in a group and see if other more experienced crocheters can help you figure out which terminology you need to use. Some other differences between US terminology and UK terminology is wool versus yarn. Yarn is pretty straightforward as far as what that means. What I have found out is online and in various other countries outside the US, sometimes people will use the phrase wool to refer to yarn in general. When I think of wool, I think specifically of the fiber content and specifically that it is wool from a sheep. However, I've encountered on occasion other individuals using the term wool to refer to yarn in general, whether it's acrylic yarn or cotton yarn, or maybe it actually is made from wool. I don't know for sure why this difference exists. It could be that most yarn in other places actually is wool fiber content. The second thing I wish I knew when I was a beginner crocheter. So let's say you've got your yarn and you've got your hook. Hooks have a name. Traditionally, their name has 2 components. It has a letter and it has a millimeter measurement. Here is the thing with hook names. The letter names are not standardized. At this point, I've been crocheting for over a decade, and since I've started buying crochet hooks, I have seen changes. For instance, I bought a hook that was size N and it was 9 millimeters. However, today, if I wanted to buy that same exact size N hook from the same exact manufacturer, it is now a 10mm crochet hook. So not only do different companies assign their own letters to the millimeter measurement, but even within one company, it can change over the years. The letter names that go with my great-grandmother's hooks that she gave me have a different millimeter measurement than the hooks that I have with the same letter name. So I would highly recommend that you don't worry about the letter name. Focus on the millimeter measurement. That way you will know you are using the correct size hook for your project. Having said that, the good news is most hooks with the same letter name will be very similar in size, even if they're not exactly the same size. For instance, I have several hooks that are labeled size G. Some of them are 4mm hooks, some of them are 4.25mm hooks. So it's not that huge of a difference. It should be pretty close. However, it is something to be aware of if you want to be consistent in your projects. All right, number 3, this one kind of has nothing to do with anything. This was just something that I was curious about, and I recently did some experimenting to find out the answer. If you are crocheting and your hook falls out of your project, you will be left with a little loop and you'll need to put your hook back in. However, sometimes that little loop gets twisted around, and I wondered for a long time, which way do I need to put my hook back in? Because one end of that loop is connected to the previous stitch and the other end connects to the working tail of yarn that's connected to your yarn skein. After some investigating, what I discovered is the correct way to reinsert your hook is so that way the piece that's feeding from your yarn skein, the working end of the yarn, comes over the front of the hook towards you. Does this actually make a difference? Not really. It's gonna make a slight difference in the visual look of it if you know what you're looking for. It's not really gonna make a difference in the actual end result of the project, but if your hook has ever fallen out and you've wondered which way do I need to put it back in, now you know. The 4th thing I wish I had known when I was a beginner crocheter is that you can use any yarn that you want to use. I remember when I had a friend show me how to crochet and I went to AC Moore to go pick up my supplies. She told me go get this hook and go pick out some yarn. And I remember looking at the wall of yarn and being so overwhelmed. It was so stressful and I was terrified I was gonna pick the wrong kind of yarn. The good news is there's no such thing as a wrong kind of yarn. There's no rule that says these yarns can only be used for these projects, and there's no kind of yarn that this is beginner yarn and this is not beginner yarn. Now, as you might guess, there are some yarns that work better for other projects than others, but when you first start and don't have a lot of experience, you're not going to really know which yarn is better for which project, and that is okay. That's something you'll learn with time. Though you can use any yarn technically to learn to crochet, some yarns are going to make the learning experience a lot easier, and some are going to make you want to quit crocheting and just completely give up on it. So since I don't want you to get frustrated and give up on learning to crochet, here is what I would look for when picking out your first skein of yarn. Firstly, I would pick a yarn that is not delicate yarn. Nothing that is thin, nothing that is super lightweight and silky and delicate. Avoid that. Now, that doesn't mean you have to go with the biggest, chunkiest yarn, although you can go with that. But what I would recommend looking for is an acrylic yarn that's labeled weight 4 or weight 5. I'll explain more how to figure that out in another point in this video. When you pick out your yarn, do not go with anything fuzzy. If you go with a yarn that's fuzzy, it is 1, very challenging to unravel if you make a mistake, and 2, it's near impossible to see the stitching. Some people really like to learn crochet with chenille yarns or something like Bernat blanket yarn. Those ones you can learn with them. However, it can be tricky to see what the stitches look like. And when you're learning, it's really important to be able to see your stitches clearly so you know where to work and so you can get familiar with how your stitches look. So that is why I personally would strongly recommend going with an acrylic yarn that's a weight 4 or a weight 5. These yarns are going to look kind of like your standard yarn. What I mean by that is if you have a relative who back in the 70s crocheted an Afghan and they've passed it down to the family, the way that yarn looks, that's the kind of yarn I would highly recommend learning to crochet with. And the last thing when it comes to yarn to make it easier to crochet is the yarn label is going to tell you what size hook they recommend. I would recommend going up 1 or 2 hook sizes bigger. Don't worry, I'm going to explain how to find all this information out in just a minute. But first, let's talk about the 5th thing I wish I had known as a beginner crocheter. This is a big one. There are different types of crochet hooks. What I mean by different types of crochet hooks is the hooks are shaped just a little bit differently. While the differences are minimal, it can make a big difference in how the yarn feels when you're working with it. When I learned to crochet, I picked up some random hooks from the store, got to work, and what I found was sometimes I would crochet and I would have a really easy time, the yarn would work easily, and then other times I would have the hardest time. My hook would not move smoothly, I'd be splitting the yarn, I'd get caught and all tangled up, and it just did not go well. It was probably 1 or 2 years into crocheting before I realized there was a difference in the shapes of my hooks. So the two main hook styles are tapered and inline. Tapered is kind of self-explanatory. The head of the hook, so that hook portion, it's going to taper smoothly in to create the hook. The head of these hooks can look a little bit chunkier and everything's just a little bit more rounded and bulbous. Inline hooks, on the other hand, instead of tapering in smoothly, it's like someone took a flat plane and notched the barrel of the hook and notched the base of the hook. So instead of being rounded, the hook is going to be more flat in the section where it catches the yarn. The defining difference between tapered and inline is the way the inside of the hook looks and the way the barrel tapers down. Having said that, there can still be differences even within tapered hooks and differences within inline hook. For instance, some tapered hooks are pointier than other tapered hooks, or your inline hook might have a fatter handle than another inline hook. The important thing to know is hooks are divided into those two main categories. Now you might be wondering which one is better if you are a beginner crocheter. And the answer to that is it comes down to the individual. I personally am team tapered hooks. Other people love inline hooks. The reason I really like tapered hooks is I tend to find it's easier to insert the hook into my project and into my stitching, and I find that I split the yarn less. With inline hooks, I tend to split the yarn a lot, and that slows me down. Now, just because I prefer tapered hooks doesn't mean that you have to prefer tapered hooks. The main reason I mention this is so that way you can play around and find what works best for you. So maybe you started off with a tapered hook, and you're just kind of really fiddly, which when you learn to crochet, you're like going to be all thumbs, and it's going to feel so awkward. But maybe you've been crocheting for a month, you can make your stitches pretty consistently, but it's just kind of a struggle and doesn't feel smooth. Well, maybe it'd be worth trying using an inline hook. You might find that it works better for you, more smoothly and faster. The other reason I mention this is if you're like me and you have different varieties of hooks, you might find that some hooks you work better with and some hooks you struggle more with. And if you assess whether they're tapered or inline, you might find that the hooks that you have the easiest time working with are all inline or they're all tapered, and vice versa for the hooks that you struggle to work with. Again, it's totally a preference whether you prefer tapered or inline, and for some people they get the exact same results and don't see a difference, but I want to mention it so you can play around and find what works best for you. And finally, the sixth thing I wish I had known as a beginner crocheter was how to read a yarn label. Yarn labels are packed with so much information, but it can be really confusing if you've never looked at a yarn label before. Today, I'm going to focus in on the things that are going to be helpful for you as a beginner crocheter. Firstly, yarn labels are going to tell you how much yarn is in the skein, and they tell you this by yardage and meters and weight. So basically length and weight. If you're following a pattern and it says you need this many yards or this much weight of yarn, now you know how to figure out how many skeins you'll need for that project. It can also be helpful as you gain a little bit of experience with crocheting to understand how much yarn you're getting and how much yarn you're using for a project. The second thing that is really helpful when reading yarn labels is the fiber content. The fiber content is going to tell you what it is made out of. So it could be something like acrylic, it could be something like cotton, it could be wool or poly or any of a number of fiber contents. It can also be a blend of multiple types of fiber contents. Now, as I mentioned earlier, when you're starting, I highly recommend working with just an acrylic yarn because those tend to work very smoothly and easy and they're very beginner friendly. But as you gain experience, don't be afraid to venture out into other types of fiber contents. Different fiber contents can create different feels to your finished project, and it can open up a whole new world of textures and colors. The third piece of information on a yarn label that can be really helpful is the recommended hook size. Most yarn labels will have a recommended hook size as well as recommended knitting needle sizes. On occasion though, some very thin yarns won't even have a recommended crochet hook size because thinner yarns tend to work better for knitting even though you can crochet with them. When you find the box that shows the recommended crochet hook size, there's going to be a lot of extra information there. You only need to pay attention to one thing, and that is going to be the millimeter measurement. Remember earlier how I talked about hooks have kind of two names? They have a letter name and a millimeter measurement. The yarn label will probably show you both a letter name and the millimeter measurement, but because the letter names are not standardized, pay attention just to the millimeter measurement. Another thing I mentioned earlier is I said when starting out, it can be good to go up a hook size or two from what's recommended on the yarn label. If the yarn label recommends a 5mm hook, try going up to a 5.5mm or a 6mm. Quite honestly, with most worsted weight yarns when you're beginning, I find that 6mm or 6.5mm is a great hook size that's nice and chunky for beginning, so that way your tension isn't too tight and you can easily see your stitches. A fourth thing that is helpful to look for on a yarn label is the yarn weight. Now, I've kind of muddied the waters a little bit here because earlier I talked about the yarn weight when I was talking about the length of the yarn and the yarn weight. However, when I talked about the yarn weight earlier, I was meaning how much does the yarn weigh? So it could be in ounces, it could be in grams. How much does it weigh? When we talk about yarn weight, we're not really talking about how much it weighs, but we're talking about how thick or thin the yarn is. You can think of it like how heavy is the yarn. Very similar to other things like wire. Wire has different gauges that tell you how thick or thin it is. It can be really helpful knowing how thick or thin a yarn is. When I was talking about what yarn to pick for your first projects, I mentioned using a weight 4 yarn. Weight 4 is kind of in the middle towards the bigger end. It's also referred to as worsted weight yarn. Since I recommended working with a weight 4, it's obviously helpful to know what a weight 4 is so you can find that yarn. But another reason it's helpful is because it allows us to compare different yarns with each other. If I have two different weight 4 yarns, even though they could be very different, they're going to be a similar thickness. Or if I find a yarn that's weight 2 and I'm really needing a weight 4, that's going to let me know that that yarn is too thin. Now, one last thing on yarn labels. If you buy yarn, you throw out the label and then you go, oh, I don't know what kind of fiber content this is. Most of the information that is on the yarn label is also available online. So as long as you know what type of yarn it is you're using, you can look up online on the seller's website to get all that same information, including the yardage, the fiber content, and wash instructions, all online if you no longer have the yarn label. So there you have it. Those are the 6 things that I wish I had known when I was a beginner crocheter. Learning to crochet, it's one of those things where when you start, you simply don't know what you don't know. And I hope that this video gives you a little bit more information and puts some ideas in your head of things to watch for and to start paying attention to as you learn to crochet. If you're a beginner crocheter, I want to hear from you. Which of these things had you never heard of before in your crochet journey? And if you're a more experienced crocheter, I want you to share in the comments what you think people should know when they start to crochet. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this video helpful, I would appreciate it so much if you subscribe to my channel, and I would also appreciate if you left a thumbs up on the video. It helps my channel out so much, and I am so grateful for all of y'all. Have fun crocheting and happy crafting!